There is a part 1 to this podcast, so if you haven't seen it already, I suggest you go check that out. But if not, stick around and we'll show you some interesting stuff. Welcome back to part 2 of the bikepacking journey through Europe following Patrick Leigh Fermor's experience in 1933. I did my journey through Germany, Austria, Slovakia and Hungary in 2024 in June. So a little bit different, going by bicycle instead of on foot. This podcast is to compare experiences travelling through Europe with Patrick Leigh Fermor's journey on foot from the Hook of Holland down to Istanbul.
I was so excited by the thought that the frontiers of Austria and Czechoslovakia and Hungary were about to converge. Though separated by the river, I was opposite Czechoslovakian territory already. I planned to wheel left into the Republic and attack Hungary later on from the flank. In reality, I was even closer than that. I was wandering across the field when a man in uniform began shouting from the dike road overhead. Where the devil did I think I was going? It was the Austrian frontier post. "You were walking straight into Czechoslovakia," the official said reproachfully, as he stamped my passport. I left the eagles and the red and white road barrier behind. The next frontier, after a search of no man's land, was closed by a barrier of red, white and blue. Another rubber stamp was smacked down by a broad Czechoslovakian official with the Lion of Bohemia on his cap. My fourth country, I thought exultantly.
So, Patrick Leigh Fermor had just reached his fourth country there, and I'd just come into my third country when I made it into Slovakia there. There was no signs of any border security when I made it there, as it's all Schengen zone nowadays. But there was a World War II bunker that was left for Slovakia's defence against Austria and the German powers at the start of World War II. Unfortunately, Slovakia and the Czech Republic, which were then Czechoslovakia, one country, were all annexed directly under Hitler's power in 1938. So the bunker didn't even see any usage. But I went and had a look. There was a machine gun position that had intercrossing fields of fire and these tank defences called Dragon's Teeth, made of concrete, that were across the region surrounding Bratislava.
The Danube inspires those who live on its banks with an infectious passion. My companions knew everything about the river. They rejoiced in the fact that after the Volga, which was almost too far away to count, it was the largest river in Europe, and the man in Loden added that it was the only one that flowed from west to east.
I was impressed by the amount of water that was flowing in the Danube. I'd gone past quite a few rivers on my trip. I followed the Isar River up from Munich as it was a quicker route than what Patrick Leigh Fermor had taken. It was in full spate and had been flooded from the previous week of straight rainfall in southeastern Germany, and I spotted lots of flooding in fields in the surrounding area and a tractor that had been half submerged up above its bonnet.
We looked out of the window. The flood was rushing by under the stars. It was the widest river in Europe, it went on, and the richest by far in interesting life. Over 70 different kinds of fish swim in it. It had its own species of salmon and 2 distinct kinds of pike perch. Stuffed specimens of a few of them were hung round the walls in glass cases. At night, the stars flashed in a cloudless void. Nothing but an early brief mist dimmed the pale skies in the morning, and the snow on the peaks were coloured at both ends of each day by almost too poignant a flush. I felt I had been let loose amongst a prodigality of marvels, and the thought was made more exhilarating still by the illusion of privacy. This landscape might have been an enormous and unending park, scattered with woods and temples and pavilions, for often the only footprint in the snow were mine. Through the last water meadow, before the mountains resumed their grip, I was approaching one of those landmarks. High on a limestone bluff, beneath two baroque towers and a taller central dome, tiers of uncountable windows streamed away into the sky. It was Melk at last, a long conventual palace, cruising above the roofs and the trees, a quinquereme among abbeys.
I also was quite impressed with the architecture in Melk. The abbey up on the hill was quite palatial in its visage. The day that I went there, I'd came in with two friends, Mia and Alessio, who'd travelled from Venezuela, where they'd been going bikepacking for 3 months, and I met them along the Danube in Austria. And when I came across them, I was happy to finally met some people on about day 7. And as we travelled together, we went to Melk and then to the next town over where there was campsite. And I had to return to Melk to receive my maps that had been sent out because I had them ordered too late. And because of this, I went to a post office and got grumbled at in German, which is on me for not knowing as much German because my S2 skills weren't quite up to scratch. I never did receive those maps. Coming into Vienna, I did see some anti-aircraft flak towers built out of massive concrete that were still left there because they're too big to remove, so they're just sitting dead. But in Fermor's time, when he visited Vienna, there was the uprising of socialists that was suppressed by the incumbent fascist government that was taking over back in the start of 1934. I didn't have any such issues other than some minor flooding redirecting the way me, Mia and Alessio went into Vienna. It wasn't quite so dreary and covered in rubbish. Lots of graffiti, but not rubbish on my journey into Vienna. And we attempted to go to a club called Flex Club, which is pretty dreary by at least Vienna's standards. But I quite loved the city. See how Fermor feels about it.
The surroundings were even more depressing by daylight. The hostel lay in the Kolonitz-Gasse in the 3rd district between the loading bays of the custom house and the grimy arches of a viaduct and an overhead railway track, silent now like the whole derelict quarter. Rubbish seemed to cover everything. Our track took us over the Rodetsky Bridge and beside the Danube Canal through a dismal scene of sad buildings and dirty snow under a cloudy sky. We turned up the Roten Turmstrasse, and as we made our way into the inner city, things began to change. We passed St. Stephen's Cathedral and its single Gothic spire. The barriers and the roadblocks of the day before were still there, but passage was free, and for the moment no gunfire sounded in the distance. The city seemed to have returned to normal. Palaces began to assemble, fountains rose, and monuments with fantastical elaboration. We crossed the Graben to the Amhofplatz, passing a tall pillar with a statue of the Virgin. We headed for the street the other side, where a flagpole and a tin oval with the lion and the unicorn indicated the British consulate. The clerk inside looked in all the pigeonholes for a registered letter. There was nothing.
Apparently in wartime you can't really get a letter. I don't know what the excuse was for postage for me. A large portion of this project was initially centred around busking as well as cycling. I had a small 3/4 size guitar acoustic strapped to my bike for most of the journey. It did get chewed up in the wheel one time, but mostly survived. It was going to go in the bin anyway, but I decided to use inspiration from Fermor to take my guitar and go busking to try and sustain my travels a bit extra. So I went to the park in front of the Hofburg in Vienna, and it was a nice sunny day, and I managed to make 13 whole euros. This was surprising, seeing as I was pretty tired. It was my first day off, and I'd spent the first night in Vienna drinking with Alessio and Mia, so needed to do a bit of recovery.
We turned left into the Mikkelkerke. It was dark inside, and after the classical surroundings, unexpectedly gothic and empty, except for a beadle who was lighting candles for an impending mass. We settled in a pew, and after perfunctory prayers for the beadle's benefit, Conrad said, "Ach, Michael, all is not lost. I have been ripening a plan. Have you your sketch block by you?" I tapped the pocket of my greatcoat, and he unfolded his plan, which was that I should sketch professionally from house to house. I was appalled, firstly from timidity, secondly out of a very well-founded modesty. I protested that my drawings of him had been a lucky exception. Usually they were very amateurish. Putting a suggestion into practice would almost be taking money under false pretences. Conrad quickly overrode these objections. "Think of wandering artist at fairs. Where's my spirit of enterprise?" His siege was mild but firm. I gave in, and soon I began to feel rather excited. Before we left, I thought of lighting a candle to bring us luck, but we hadn't a single coin between us. We headed for the Maria Hilf quarter. Falling into step, he said, "We will commence with the small buggers." To my surprise, for his usual discourse was rather prim. I asked him, "What small buggers?" He stopped dead, and a blush began to spread, until it had been entirely mantled his long face. "With little burghers, the rich and the noble here." He waved his hand around the whole city. He thought I should ask for 5 shillings a picture. I said it was too much. I would ask for 2. A bit more than an English shilling, in fact.
5 shillings in their day is worth about £7.50 today. Across Fermor's whole travels, he had a budget of about £90 a week in today's money, which is quite impressive. I don't know how the cost ratios differ between different locations, but I ended up spending about €140 or something a week, and that was still pretty reasonable, but I had shorter time to spend, and also I guess there's inflation on drinks especially, or maybe just my drinking habit has inflated. Who knows? Anyway, Patrick Leigh Fermor had travelled 750 miles, which is pretty similar to the distance that I'd travelled across my whole journey. He'd done 750 by the time he got to Vienna, and he will describe it to you.
Surrounded by maps and atlases in the Academy Library, I discovered that as the crow flies between Rotterdam and Constantinople, I was a little less than halfway. But no crow would have flown in the enormous loop that I had followed, and when I plotted the route and stepped it out with dividers, the total came to a great deal more than half. Not that this meant much. The rest of the journey was sure to take an equally tortuous course. I knocked off the miles for the trip on the Rhine barge and the lifts I'd taken in bad weather, and found that the distance I'd actually slogged on my 2 feet was 750 miles. The journey had lasted 62 days, and when I'd struck out the halts of more than one night and divided the distance by the time, the average worked out at 12 miles a day. Bearing in mind a few marches from daybreak till long after dark, but conveniently forgetting the times I'd merely strolled to the next village, I was a little disappointed. I'd imagined it was far more, but I was delighted with everything else. I never tired of recapitulating the journey. I had crossed 3 parallels of latitude and 11 meridians, and moved over from the North Sea, still called the German Ocean on all maps, to a minute line of longitude running from the Baltic to the southeast Adriatic. Even looked at from the moon, so the terrestrial and celestial globe suggested, the distance covered would have been as discernible as the Great Wall of China.
So that was the journey, the main section of the body of the journey through Europe, and I had a fantastic time following Patrick Leigh Fermor's footsteps, and I'm going to continue this podcast series with a few more very soon. Thank you for listening so far. Next episode we'll be looking at what sort of equipment to bring, and maybe talking to some other bikepackers. Thanks for your time.